Morning, everyone. Welcome to the April meeting of the Metropolitan Transportation Authority Board. Mr. Morello, do we have any public speakers?
We have just three, Mr. Chairman. As usual, I'll ask all of our speakers to try to keep to the allotted time or thereabouts so that we can treat all the speakers equitably. The first speaker is Brandon Mosley. He'll be followed by Pedro Valdez Rivera. Mr. Mosley?
Thank you and good morning. As mentioned, I'm Brandon Mosley, and I'm here on behalf of Access Queens. On April 5th, we had a town hall with Ms. Ronnie Hakim, and we want to extend our thanks, many thanks for that. She also brought several other colleagues and teammates with her, and it gave us the opportunity as 7 train riders who live in Queens, Western Queens, to address a variety of concerns. The event was very helpful and an important step toward improving our relationship as customers, but also just as customer service between the MTA and residents who rely on the 7 train every day. Again, we'd like to extend our thanks for the time spent speaking with us and for the changes that have already been made, particularly with some of the communication. We look forward to continued dialogue and additional communication improvements in the near future, as well as some consideration from the MTA on more bus service along Queens Boulevard and other areas where, when the 7 train is shut down during the weekend, people still need to get around. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mosley. Pedro Valdez Rivera, and he'll be followed by our last speaker, Jason Anthony Pinheiro.
Good morning, MTA. My name is Pedro Valdez Rivera Jr., and I'm a member of the Rise Alliance, a grassroots organization dedicated to fighting for affordable fares and better transit service across the city of New York for subway, bus, and commuter rail riders. And I'm here to express my support on the New York City Transit Fund and particularly on select bus service. One of the bus routes that proved to be very successful is the Q70 bus, which goes from Woodside Long Island Railroad Station through the Jackson Heights Roosevelt Avenue subway station into LaGuardia Airport at making legitimate stops. And there's a lot of people taking the advantage of the Q70. And I call it the MTA's guiltiest pleasures. And I'm really proud of the MTA getting more service to the Q70, but I still see a lot more tourists, a lot more people, a lot more employees at LaGuardia Airport want to add to jam in the Q70 buses. I wish there would be faster service, and that's why I applaud you to implement select bus service on the Q70. And the reason why is because Governor Cuomo recently want to renovate the LaGuardia Airport to have open. And in conclusion, Governor Cuomo wants to expand LaGuardia Airport, add more runways, add more space, more passengers. That means the Q70 bus needs to be more reliable, more frequent, and more sustainable and more accountable for all the riders who get there from the airport to their destination. And I support and definitely look forward to this discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Rivera. Last speaker, Jason Anthony Pinheiro. Mr. Pinheiro.
Good morning, all MTA board members. My name is Jason Anthony Pinheiro. I'm the author of the YouTube series Stay at the Track, what evaluates the track conditions on all subway stations in the city since August 2015. And I want to tell the MTA, clean the tracks. They need attention, especially in Manhattan and downtown Brooklyn. And as a Brooklyn resident, I will tell the MTA to put more reliable service along the 4th Avenue line, because with the R by itself is not enough. And we could have more select bus service routes in Brooklyn, in Queens, and the Bronx, and bring the newer equipment, like the R142A, back where it originally belongs, on the 6th. And bringing new equipment to a Concourse 6th Avenue Express West End line. Because it's a total disgrace having equipment that are old as myself. And I demand more countdown clocks in stations in Brooklyn, like in Atlantic Avenue Barclays Center, and Nevin Street and Ball Hall. So thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. I would note that Mr. Rivera and Mr. Pinero both appeared and spoke at our recent hearing on service. Thank you for testifying at that as well. That concludes the public comment, Mr. Chairman.
I have some remarks before we get into the business part of the meeting. As I'm sure you've all heard, earlier this month, Governor Cuomo and the state legislature passed a budget that includes the largest ever investment in the MTA, $27 billion. Also, for the 5th consecutive year, the governor has assured a year-to-year increase in our operating funds. On behalf of the entire MTA, I want to take this effort and opportunity to thank Governor Cuomo for his determined efforts to secure this critical funding. Our thanks also go to Senate Majority Leader Flanagan, Speaker Heastie, and their members who recognize that public transport is the very backbone of New York's economy. And of course, I want to thank all of you on the board who worked behind the scenes in the public advocate, as the public advocate, on the sale of this indispensable capital program. Later in the meeting, Craig Stewart will describe how the actions taken by the legislature affect the 2015-19 capital program, and we will then ask for a vote on the revised program so that it can be forwarded as expeditiously as possible to the Capital Program Review Board for their approval. But first, I want to say a few words about this landmark financial commitments. In no uncertain terms, this is a monumental win for the people in New York, and not just New York City or its suburbs, but for all the communities across the entire state. This program includes billions of dollars for the essential work of keeping our transit system safe and reliable. As the governor requested, the program also will help us build a truly 21st century transit system, improving the daily experience for the 8.7 million customers who depend on the system each and every day. It will allow us to expand our system to meet the ridership and growth demands of today and tomorrow. And just this week, we announced that annual subway ridership increased once again this year to 1.768 billion, the highest since 1948. And notably, the governor has earmarked more than $1 billion for the second phase of the 2nd Avenue subway into East Harlem. On a larger scale, these investments will create hundreds of thousands of jobs, fuel the region's $1.4 trillion economy, the second largest economy in the world, and improve what is a $1 trillion asset. That's the scale of the asset we're working with, and it's an asset that the region simply could not live without. Many of you have heard me say this before, but I want to say it again because it's as true as it has ever been. I came back to the MTA in 2009 as president of New York City Transit, and one of the main reasons I chose to do so because at the end of the day, New York gets its act together and funds capital program needs for this region's system. There are few, if any, systems in the country that do that to this order of magnitude. The capital program is no exception to this. Next, I'd like to remind a number of people, as many of you do remember, one key strategy in the Transportation Reinvention Commission's 2014 report was for us to embrace a more entrepreneurial approach to revenue generation. The Commission suggested we work more aggressively to optimize assets like real estate, and today we're doing just that. Later in the meeting, we'll be voting to approve a long-term lease that will allow us to monetize our former headquarters at 341, 345, and 347 Madison. And these types of deals are great for everyone. It works for the MTA because it will generate hundreds of millions of dollars for our capital program. It works for our customers who would see better and feel the benefit of these capital expenditures through better service. And it works for New York City because the city could improve and develop these properties at the heart of what we call our Cathedral Grand Central Terminal, one of the most valuable real estate assets in the entire world. We'll talk more about the capital program and this lease later in the meeting. The minutes of last month's meeting have been distributed to all members. Are there any, could I have a motion to approve? Second, any comments and questions regarding those minutes? All in favor? Aye. Committee on Finance. There's one action item this month. The action item requests the board to approve the 2015 annual investment report and the MTA all-agency investment guidelines. The committee recommends this action item, and I move it. Any comments or questions? All in favor? Aye. There are 5 procurement actions this month in the total amount of $71.5 million. There are no non-competitive procurements. There are 5 competitive procurements totaling $71.5 million. The committee recommends these procurements, and I move them. Any comments or questions? All in favor? Aye. There are no ratifications. There is one real estate item from committee this month. The item is described on pages 48 through 52 in the board book distributed in this meeting. The committee recommends this real estate item, and I move it. Comments, questions? You will recall in the February Finance Committee meeting, there was a motion forward to recommend the disposition of the former MTA headquarters buildings on Madison Avenue from a long-term ground lease. The action was tabled, and the board did not consider a vote to approve at this time. In front of you is a revised staff summary relating to the Madison Avenue building, and the MTA and the city have not come to agreement on how the pilot will be allocated. And that was a discussion that we committed to having at the time we tabled it in February. We're continuing to negotiate with the city in an attempt to reach a fair and equitable resolution that provides the MTA with the anticipated level of funding from the development, and the board is being asked to authorize me to finalize an agreement with the city with respect to the pilot allocation that, in my judgment, is the best interest of the MTA. I will report back to the board at the June meeting as to the status of those negotiations, if not sooner. If at that time a resolution has not been reached, I will ask the MTA Board to consider alternative paths forward for the development that would meet the MTA's objective, including the provision of an adequate level of funding. Any further comments or questions?
Yep, I have a comment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Look, I think it's no secret the city still opposes the deal as presented to the board today. I think we do remain hopeful that we can continue our negotiations. And just to make clear, I think to go to something you said, the city does think that this would be a good deal for the MTA. We've been working very closely with the MTA to look at the rezoning issues, and I think create a potential of, in excess of $100 million in value through zoning changes. So I do think we hope we can find a way forward, but as of today, the city is, I'm going to be on record, is still opposing moving forward with this vote.
Any other comments or questions? Could I have a motion on the item as proposed in the staff summary? Second. Any further comments or questions? All in favor? Aye. So moved.
Please record me as a no.
2 noes. 2 noes. 3 noes. Okay. Mr. Capelli, Mr. Kay, Ms. Strottenberg. And now I have a report from the Transit Committee. Mr. Ferrer.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. The Transit and Bus Committee met on Monday and reports the following. There are 12 procurement actions this month in the total amount of $2.2 million. There are no non-competitive procurements. There are 12 competitive procurements which are found on pages 52 through 62 of the board book in the total amount of $2.2 million. The committee recommends these procurements, and I move them.
Second. Any comments or questions? All in favor?
Aye. There are no ratifications, and that concludes the Transit and Bus Committee report.
Thank you very much. We had a joint Long Island Railroad Metro North Committee. Mr. Pally will give that report.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. The Metro North Railroad and Long Island committees met jointly this month and report the following. There are 12 procurement actions in the total amount of $65 million. There are 2 non-competitive procurements, one for Long Island Railroad in the amount of $60,000 and one for Metro North Railroad for $1.3 million. The committee recommends these procurements, and I move them.
Second. Any comments or questions? All in favor? Aye.
There are 9 competitive procurements, 5 for Metro North Railroad totaling $12.8 million, 2 for the Long Island Railroad totaling $37,000, and 2 for MTA Capital Construction in the amount of $48.6 million. The committee recommends these procurements, and I move them.
Any comments or questions? All in favor? Aye.
There is 1 ratification for MTA Capital Construction in the amount of $1.5 million. The committee recommends this ratification, and I move it.
Any comments or questions? All in favor? Aye.
This concludes the report. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pally. Now report from Chairman Alan Capelli, Bridges and Tunnels.
Mr. Chairman, Bridges and Tunnels Committee met this month and report that there are no actions or procurement items to present for a report, so thank you.
I have a safety report which I chaired. There is one action item this month, and that action item requests the board to approve the revisions to the Safety Management Policy Directive. The committee recommends this action, and I move it.
Second.
Any comments or questions? All in favor?
Aye.
The next item will be our discussion on the third time we've had it at the board meeting capital program, because we had it first back in September of 2014, last October. This is the third pass. Presentation from Mr. Craig Stewart on where we stand on the program we'd like to take action to approve and submit to the CPRB. Craig?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There are several important changes to our 15 to 19 capital program since it was approved last October. There are two basic changes in the plan. The additional $500 million is being added to second phase of 2nd Avenue, and a revision in the mix of stations, component and enhancement stations, and several new stations that are being added to the program. You may recall that component stations, we fix what's broken, and in the enhancement stations, we fix what's broken, and we also add some customer amenities and improve the station environment. The revision to the 2015 to 19 program allocates an additional $500 million proposed for new starts funding for 2nd Avenue Phase 2. This increases the allocation from $535 million to $1,035 million and is subject to further discussion with the FTA. It also will require additional local funding to meet the requirements for the full funding grant agreement that we will be applying for with the FTA. The governor challenged us to provide a better station environment for our passengers with enhanced station customer-facing amenities and to deliver these projects faster. We will utilize design, build, and other delivery methods to ensure that these improvements are delivered in the fastest and most efficient manner possible. This slide details the Enhanced Station Initiative. There are a total of 41 stations that are part of this initiative. 31 are in the New York City Transit program, and 5 in the Long Island Railroad, 5 in Metro North, and there's also an additional new station added to the program for Willets Point. The mix of funding for the revised program 15 to 19 remains relatively unchanged, with the exception of the $500 million assumed as new starts funding for the 2nd Avenue Subway 2 Phase 2 project, and which will be further subject to discussion with the FTA. Again, we will seek a full funding agreement with the FTA on 2nd Avenue, and this will include additional commitments and funding for the 20 to 24 capital program. This concludes my presentation. I'll be glad to answer any questions.
Any comments or questions on the plan, the presentation, or discussions we've had prior about the plan?
I
Ms.
have
Trotmer?
a question, Mr. Chairman. In light of the discussion that we just had, and I just want to say, look, I think we're all very happy to be here today. It is a tribute to the hard work of you and your team that we're finally, I think, going to vote on the capital plan, and it's going to move forward. And obviously, the city has been pleased to be a part of what really turned out to be a historic agreement between the city and the state, and a major contribution on the city's part. But while this, I guess we'll say, the pilot issue on the sale of the headquarters remains unresolved, I think it's important just to clarify that the pilot is not a necessary part of this capital plan. I know it's something you all want, and we're going to, I think, find a way forward on that. But I want to be supportive of this capital plan, but just clarify that basically I think the rental revenues are sufficient to cover what's accounted for in this capital plan.
I'm going to ask our Chief Financial Officer, Bob Ferran, to answer that question. I believe the answer is yes, but Bob?
The value of the ground rent is sufficient to cover the funding that we have for the capital program.
Okay, thanks, Bob. Because I want to make clear on the city's part, I think we very much want to be supportive, and like everyone in this room, I think, see this capital plan move forward, but we have not yet come to an agreement on how the pilot is allocated, and I don't want any vote on my part to be taken that we're assenting to that being part of the capital plan, because I just don't think we've reached agreement on that yet.
And
So
I would
noted. So noted.
Mr. Chairman, I'd also like to add, there are certain other costs that we know we're going to incur. For us to get the special permit for the upzoning of our facility for the new developer, we think we're going to have to make about $120 to $150 million of off-site improvements. They're not in our capital program, but we believe that we're going to be required to do that. Secondly, we've incurred about $70 million of moving expenses and relocation expenses to bring everybody down to 2 Broadway. We need to recover that. So again, those are the nature of the cost that we would like to see recovered through the pilot. And so that's
Right,
But that's separate and apart from the
right,
capital
that's subject
program
to the
we're approving
negotiation,
today.
not, this capital plan doesn't address that. We'll
That's right.
hopefully work together to get that resolved in the
Right.
future.
I
Thank
think
you.
I think we already passed a resolution that says you're going to have the authority over the next 2 months to work out all these issues. So I would like to make a motion to move that we approve the capital plan.
I have a bunch of questions. This is probably the largest action this board will take in a long time. And I think some diligence and some look at what we're doing and how this is being funded should be discussed. So I have a bunch of questions, so forgive me. I'll try to be as brief as possible. First of all, I do think passing the capital plan, which hopefully we will do today, and having the commitment from Albany and the city and the MTA to do something is something well needed and something we've waited a very long time to do, probably longer than any other capital plan in the last 20 years. And so I congratulate everyone for doing that. Just a couple questions. The extra 31 stations in the plan, you mentioned that some stations were added, some stations were part of the component program. What dropped out of the plan in order to fund the additional 31 stations, including the Mets Willets Point station?
I'll let Craig go into more detail, but there aren't extra. What we did is the original program, as approved back in September of 14, had 20 enhancements and some 150 components. We now have 31 enhancements and the remainder components, so we changed in the mix of stations. Do you want to elaborate further,
Sure,
Craig?
and those stations are going to cost more, and funding, the agencies didn't drop anything from their program. They funded it from contingencies and reduction in scope on other projects, but they did not drop anything from the program.
And the other thing that we're doing, Jeff, is we are changing our relationship not only with contractors with respect to how we expect to deliver the stations with design build, but there was a lot in the one statement that Craig had in the slide about get in, get done, and get out. So we're going to give them bigger windows of opportunity to do work. We expect both of those actions to drive costs down in the program as we deliver enhanced stations.
As we talked about in committee, I think that new approach is going to be an interesting one that I hope is extremely successful and hopefully will be a template for moving forward. So I think that's really helpful. On the 2nd Avenue subway, I see that we added the extra $500 million, and I think the intention there is to try to get the federal New Start program. I think that's what I read. I received various press releases from folks in Albany saying that we were providing $1.5 billion for the 2nd Avenue subway, but that money was going to come later. That's not anything in this capital plan. Presumably, that's a discussion for another capital plan?
I'll start and I'll let Craig finish. In the plan that was approved last time, we had $545 million.
535.
535. There was an extensive discussion because people were surprised that in the negotiations between the city and the state, the number had actually come down for what we had for 2nd
Actually,
Avenue.
we had $1.5 billion in the original one.
Then why don't you start from the top?
Okay. we began with $1.5 billion, and it was reduced in the second revision to 535. We're adding back $500 million, assuming that it will be New Start's funding from the federal program.
Mm-hmm.
We will have to come up with additional funds in order to apply for that New Start's grant.
In local funds?
Yes.
Is that what they're referring to, the extra $500 million? Or, I mean, I'm just reading press releases that I received from local assemblymen in the area saying that there's going to be a commitment in the next capital plan, as, by the way, I would assume we would have done anyway. I mean, we've constantly always supported 2nd Avenue subway and moving forward, but there's that commitment there. So that's not in this plan. That's fair.
No, it's not in this plan, and it's tough for us to comment on other people's press releases, but I know the nature of why you're asking the question. What came out of the dialogue was, it was a clear indication from the legislature, representing their constituents and our customers, that the move to decrease 2nd Avenue subway wasn't acceptable, so we needed to get to a different place. The true cost for the next phase of Second Avenue is between $5 and $6 billion.
Right, it's a large number.
So, and there is this pent-up frustration, because for those that don't know, I just love to give trivia information, the first bond issue on Second Avenue was in the 1930s. So people don't want to pull back on the throttle, they want to keep this, because it is exceptionally important part of expansion that is critically needed. The Lexington Avenue line is the most heavily traveled line. So that's the play of the three numbers.
Okay, thank you. We're now in April, and I think you said that we've been at this since September of 14, right? So we're a year and a half in. Have we had to delay any projects as a result, or delay construction or bid of awards as a result of this? I know we were very tight, and maybe there's no real answer there, but it's been a year and a half. So this is the farthest I remember ever getting into a capital plan. Over the last 4 plans, I think we've been in.
Well, if you take the last time we had approval for 2 years, had to come back for the remaining 3, so
Yeah, I'll
there's a
get to
slight
that,
difference
yeah.
there. So this is probably about as far as we've ever gone. Critical projects awards were being made, and
Okay.
we were appropriately moving and juggling funds to be able to make those awards. The date that we would have really had a serious problem with is if we would have gotten past June 30th of this year.
So this is, passing this capital plan right now is very
Just in
critical.
time.
Just in time. I think that's great. Has the state explained how they're going to fund their $8.3 billion? I thought I saw language that suggested it might be capital, it might be debt service payments, it might be new revenue. I didn't see new revenue, but have they said in the language exactly how they're going to fund the $8.3 billion?
I don't think they've said in the language. In the last 2 sessions of the legislature, last year's and this one, there have been proposals to, each of the houses have developed proposals to be able to fund some of this, but they're part of a discussion. But it would be, it's either premature and or inappropriate to talk about one because nothing's been landed on. Do you want to expound any further in terms of the commitment being made, Bob?
Yeah, basically, the state is reserving its prerogatives to either provide us with direct grants out of revenues or other one-time revenues, or to provide debt service. We feel comfortable that they will come up with the funds. So at this point in time, there's no need for specificity. The funding will probably, if we go according to our schedule, the funding will probably come at the back end of the capital program, because that's when we would need the funds.
And the city's 2.5, I think 657 is sure. The others need to be part of a dialogue with the legislature in terms of where that money comes from as well. So there's risk associated with both, but they're measured and balanced risks, we believe.
So Bob, you just hit something about when that's coming. The language that we've all heard for the last several months is that the MTA will get the money when the MTA needs it. Who decides when the MTA needs it?
It will be whenever we need it, or funds or other funds are not available. Should there be a delay in federal funding that we expect, the monies could come forward. We are going to keep the Division of Budget at the state apprised of the progress of our capital program, just as we normally do. And so to the extent that we can see a funding need in the future, we'll go to the Director of Budget, we'll lay it out, and then we'll come up with the funding schedule at that point.
So the MTA is going to be asked in this capital plan to issue fair-back bonds and all the other debt-raising entities or revenue that we have backing up front for the first 2 or 3 years until we run out of money again 2 or 3 years from now?
Yeah, we've already built into our financial plan sufficient monies to cover all of the debt that we need to sell based on our contribution.
Right.
So that has absolutely no impact on our fares. And the agreement we have with the state is, should we finance on their behalf, it will be with funds that the state will provide, which will no way affect the fare box.
Right,
To support that debt service.
That's right.
right. But in fact, the MTA is going to use all of its resources up front before the state and the city, I guess, will come up with their share of the funding of the plan. How that's being funded, we're still not sure.
Yeah, again, we are going to front load. We will front most of the expenditures, and we're prepared to do it, and it's built into our financial plan, so it's not putting a burden on us. However, that doesn't mean that the state won't advance funds earlier should we request, and or the city wouldn't advance funds earlier. So,
Mr. Chairman, if I could just interject, I hear where Mr. Kay is going with this or coming from. I just want to say, as a member of this board, the governor has repeatedly said publicly on the record that he's going to support and fund the state's commitment to this capital plan, and so is the mayor. I take them at their word. I haven't seen a single time where this governor hasn't lived up to his funding commitments. So I think however it's going to work out, the money will be there. The governor's office, the Division of Budget, is in constant communication with you and your staff, and I don't think we need to question anybody's commitment or whether or not the funds will be there to fund this capital program. I understand people may have been frustrated about the length of time that it's taken to get to this point, but sometimes delays are a good thing. In this case, it has been, because the plan is bigger, it's a better plan. We've come up with ways to do more design build and to reduce operating expenses on behalf of the agency. And I think at the end of the day, we have a better program and a plan for the commuters of this state. So I think I can reassure you, Mr. Kay, and any other board member that the state and the city will live up to its public commitments to fully fund the capital plan.
Thank you, Mr. Schwartz. Mr. Kay?
Let me clarify my statements. I have never questioned nor will question Albany, whether it be the governor, the assembly, the Senate, and all the factors that make up their intent, clearly. And I would always take them at their word that it's going to happen. I'm merely just asking questions as to the mechanics of it. This is the first capital, this is probably the largest and best capital plan of what's in it, no doubt about it. I fully believe that. The commitment from Albany to fund it is there. So don't misinterpret my statements. But I think it's important to clarify where the money is going to come from and when. Now, I understand that it's not coming yet, and that there is some semblance of appropriations in the state budget to provide money in this year that was put in the budget, but in fact is not going to be coming due to not having the need for several years. And I think it's important to ask the question as what that's going to be. I don't question any individual. Albany they deal with a lot of issues at a lot of times. And what happens 4 years from now? I don't know what happens 4 years from now. I don't know what happens next year. I do know that Albany has stepped up. They have said very clearly they commit to fund this plan, and the city has said they commit to fund this plan. But, history shows over time that revenues don't always come together. In the 2000 plan, 2000 to 2004, Albany didn't provide anything. I think they asked the MTA to fund it entirely on their own. And, you compare those two things, and this is clearly historic. In the 2005-2009 plan, Albany increased taxes in order to fund the MTA plan. In 2009 to 2014 plan, if I'm not mistaken in my years, they created a Ravage Commission to come up with new revenue solutions and only came up with one, being the PMT. And in fact, didn't come up with anything 3 years later. It only held us for 2 years. And I don't question anyone's commitment. I think that this plan has the opportunity to be the biggest and the best plan. All I'm pointing out is that I think that this board, and Mr. Chairman, you have said the single biggest item you have to do is get a capital plan approved. And I think that your continued commitment and diligence and this board's diligence in making sure that this process, maybe it was long, maybe it's for the better, I can appreciate that point, but you're going to be at this for several more years, making sure that we spend the money wisely, that it gets spent efficiently, and that in fact all of our partners, including ourselves, come up with the money in order to actually pay for it.
Well, I'm going to come back to you in a minute, Alan, but there's a point I want to respond to, because it's one of the underlying issues in the discussion right now about the issue of when the states and the city's payment come to the fore. When we got into the discussion, which was a healthy tension discussion with respect to the 8.3 and was originally 3.2 and ended up 2.5, both the mayor and the governor were very firm about the MTA making sure the monies it already had were spent before they were asking other entities to float debt finance to give us more money. So that was part of the discussion with respect to when the timing of the states and the city's funding came into being. It wasn't just to put off that which they didn't want to deal with today. It was putting the pressure on us to make sure we were effectively spending money, because We've got money left over from programs, 3 or 4
That's
programs
entirely
ago.
appropriate.
And that was the reason for the issue.
I think that makes sense.
And that was it. Will you finish, because before I go to Alan, I want to make sure you're done with your comments.
Yeah, I think, I just want to make sure that my statements are not misconstrued to suggest that I don't trust or I'm questioning anyone's commitment to the MTA. I think everyone here and everyone in Albany, by virtue of standing up, saying that they support the MTA and that we should move forward with this capital plan and that they're going to approve the capital plan, certainly suggests that they're supportive, in fact, guided us in that direction. I just think we need to continue to be diligent as a board to make sure that we work together with our leaders in Albany and City Hall to make sure that this plan continues over the next 5 years.
I read your comments as exercising your fiduciary responsibility, which we all have a mandate to do. Mr. Capelli?
Perhaps the third time is a charm as we attempt to take this up. First of all, Mr. Chairman, I offer you congratulations for your hard work and the loss of many hours of sleep and probably many pounds as well through stress and aggravation, guiding us to this point where we're actually going to get this done. This perhaps is my last capital budget that I'll be voting on, and I was afraid that this day might not come because of Albany's inability to get it done until now. But I will say that this is every item that's in here in this plan is something that is important to the region. And if I have a criticism, and one I've made twice before, it's that I'd like there to be more in there. There's many more things we need to do to make this city. There are transit deserts that need to be taken care of both in the city and in the suburbs, and we need to get there. I hope that I'm also pleased that this latest incarnation includes funding for the West Shore Light Rail study, something that I worked on with Senator Schumer and Senator Clinton a dozen years ago, and they passed an appropriation that got killed when earmarks got killed for both the West Shore Light Rail and the North Shore, which now the North Shore BRT, but there was money in that, and hopefully as there's likely to be a New York president, one way or the other, and as Senator Schumer continues to gain power in his respective house, I'm hoping that the agenda on the national level for federal transportation brings us needed capital dollars so that we can do many of the things that we need to do going forward, because without the federal government participating, this becomes a much more difficult task to achieve. Let me just say that I share many of the concerns of Commissioner Kay in terms of the out years being the way that we get the money here. And I have no doubt that Governor Cuomo fully intends to keep his commitments. However, my concern is who's going to be governor in 3 years? There's no way that anybody can guarantee who the legislative leaders are going to be, who the governor is going to be. So that is a risk that is inherent in a democracy. You could have somebody who's very anti-public transportation get elected, and we would have a problem. So, but having said that, I will be casting my vote for this with the hope that mass transit advocates will help us continue to push for the things that we need in transportation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Capelli, Mr. Albert, and then I'll come to you, Mr. Bellin.
I'll add my congratulations to all in getting this to this point, and hopefully pass today. Just a question of information, maybe it's for you, Craig. The additional work at Met's Willets Point, is that to accommodate the air train, the proposed air train?
It's to renovate the station and to improve the mobility there.
Both City Field on the Transit 7 and Metz Willard Point and Long Island Railroad are in need of rehabilitation anyway. So the two paths are crossing. AirTrain will be there for LaGuardia, but we need to do those stations as well. And we may do them differently in terms of design, build, and maybe even a PPP. But those decisions have been made.
AirTrain is funded by Port Authority?
AirTrain is part of the LaGuardia proposal. That's as far as I'll say, because there's a lot of details to be worked out. Mr. Bellin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to add my voice of congratulations for the hard work and the improved plan. I just have one short question to confirm with the CFO, Bob Foran, if I could. It's just that debt is, of course, a necessary and appropriate component of paying for long-term capital needs. And I just want to confirm that you're working with the rating agencies, and that they're fully apprised, and that they're working to confirm our solid ratings, funding risks and all. They're typical in every 5-year capital plan. But I want to just confirm that you're working with them, they'll be fully apprised of this, and you're comfortable with that.
Yes, I mean, we have an ongoing dialogue with the rating agencies. They're aware of the capital program. They're aware of this proposal, and we'll continue to work with them. And I have to say that, their response has been very good. The credit is perceived as a strong credit, and we're going to continue to do everything we can to maintain strong credit ratings.
If there are no further questions, we'll take the vote. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Carried. I believe that concludes the business for today's meeting. Could I have a motion to adjourn? Second. All in favor? Aye. Meeting is adjourned. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Geez, whenever I look up from the meeting, I never see you. You must come out of the woodwork or something. I don't know. And you're all sitting here now.
Hello, Tom. Question about the 2nd Avenue subway. If the problems identified this week at 72nd Street persist, do you have the ability to open and skip 72nd Street and run the trains to 86th and 96th? And if not, why not?
Theoretical question, we're not answering it this time. The independent engineer has identified some risks associated with that project with respect to our being able to open when we said we're going to open, and that's where the focus is. And the intense focus that has been on that project for the past 6 months is focused on that. So, and we're going to keep the pressure and the focus on that to get it opened. And we believe we're still going to open. We're going to meet that date.
Hey, Tom, as a follow-up to Andy's question, I think we said Monday that you were going to meet with the contractor in charge of this 72nd Street station, along with a representative from the governor's office, over signing the accelerated work agreement. Could you walk us through sort of what leverage you have and what happens if they refuse to sign it and don't actually step up to the plate come whenever the deadline is to get this thing going?
We've met with them already, to all the contractors that have work to be completed leading up through testing and commissioning so that we can open the system. And we meet with some more often because there are more issues with them. And the nature of the response that was given was along those lines. So with respect to this particular risk and this particular contractor, those meetings are ongoing to make sure 2 things. Unmistakably clear, number 1, that we want to meet the deadline. The second, what can we do collectively, all of us working together to make sure that that deadline can be met? Full stop.
But can you just kick them out and find a new contractor if they don't get the work done come December?
The process that it would take to default the contractor and bring somebody in would put us well past the December 31st date.
Hi, I had a question about the ridership stats from 2015 showing another record. I wanted to know what the MTA could be doing operationally, not in the capital plan where there's new signals and equipment replacement, but operationally, what can you do to relieve the crunch? And related to that, as a follow-up, just want to ask a second question about that. If you are raising the debt limit to cover capital needs, in the future, isn't that just going to put more stress on the operations budget so that you can't deal with the overcrowding and the crush of new riders? And
There's two separate issues. I understand how you're interrelating them, but first of all, the good news is we're seeing record ridership. That's what we're in business for. The difficulty associated with that is our ability to be able to respond. You've hit on some of the issues, one of which is the signal system and its capacity. The second, which you didn't mention, but it's the fleet size in terms of how many cars we have in the system. Because if we need to buy cars, it's not something that we just go out and buy and we get them in a few weeks. It's generally 42 to 48 months from the time you award a contract before you get cars. So you have those issues to deal with. On a line-by-line basis, there are things you can do to make changes to the particular scheduling of trains where there is room in the signal system to provide additional. You have capacity to be able to provide additional trains, but then you're limited by, in many cases, by the fleet size. Then what you've seen in some of the presentations in Transit Committee in terms of putting platform controllers out, trying to make sure we reduce the amount of dwell time in stations so trains can move more expeditiously as they come into the station, load, and then go. Those are all parts of the strategies. It's truly in the peak of the peak where we're experiencing high ridership totals across the entire day, 7 days a week. But where they're most acute is in the peak of the rush hour, morning and evening.
Sorry, just to follow up though, when you're raising the debt limit to cover capital costs, does that or does that not hamstring what you can do operationally to deal with specific instances of overcrowding?
Well, the debt limit being raised, there was a question raised by one of the board members with respect to debt limit and what the state's commitment is. So in some cases where we would be seeking more debt, past which that we've already committed to or outlined in the program, the state's going to be picking up the debt cost associated with that. So we may have it under our debt limit, but they're paying the cost of that finance. So that wouldn't put pressure on the fares. That was the significance of the Chief Financial Officer's comment that we're not putting pressure on the fares. The fares drive the operating budget.
Tom, what's your timetable on hearing of response from the Capital Program Review Board?
It's what we intend to do is submit now we've got board approval. We submit the revised plan to the Capital Program Review Board as soon as possible. They either meet and approve it, or if nobody takes action against it in 30 days, it's approved. That's the plan.
Thank you.
Sir, could you outline for us the sleep apnea program that you're now, I guess, going to impose on the entire system?
I'll do as best I can, but I'm a sleep apnea person myself. So what you do is you test the employees to see whether or not they are sleep apnea candidates, if they have a sleeping disorder, and then you go through a series of actions with respect to how you treat those, and you do that in concert with labor. The concern is to identify those employees who may be propensity to be able to have sleep apnea where they can't control themselves in terms of being able to stay awake, all times. We've started that process at Metro North. It's now migrating over to Long Island Railroad. In the longer term, we want to involve all the operating employees. The key operating employees, although 50,000 some operating employees, or 71,000 employees in the MTA are important, but truly those that operate vehicles, bus operators, train operators, locomotive engineers, conductors, it's key that we focus on them first. More details we can provide, and I'll have somebody from either Metro North, ask you, give you specific responses. But it's the idea of testing employees to see whether or not they have this condition, and then if so, what do we do to be able to treat it? And do that within the bounds of the collective bargaining agreement, because we do not have a unilateral right to take action with employees. We have to work within the bounds of the collective bargaining agreement.
Hi, Tom. With limited money in the capital program, I'm interested in why all those Long Island Railroad stations were added for rehabilitation. Was there urging by local elected officials to target those stations?
Over a period of years, I'll try to provide a context and you'll be able to understand. When I talk, I never lose sight of 1982. I can remember how decrepit and how downtrodden the system was. So I could talk state of good repair till the cows come home, okay? But for somebody who wasn't part of that dynamic, who never saw how bad the system was, they take as a given state of good repair. So they know the importance of it in a program, but they also say, for this additional money that you're going into my pocket for, what am I seeing beyond state of good repair? An enhancement. So that's why we have renew, enhance, and expand. And there are other people who say, expand. I need more capacity in the system. So the two places where we touch customers the most for the longest part of their journey with us is on the vehicles where they ride with us and in the stations where they wait for trains. Generally, they exit stations pretty fast, but they enter a station and they sit there waiting for a train or stand there waiting for a train a period of time. And so we've made a commitment, and the governor has been part of this, as has the legislature, in terms of improving that experience at a number of stations and showing people in more real time improvements that are beyond state of good repair. That's the underlying logic. Come on.
Hello. So would you say that you're confident the CPRB will approve the plan? You had said the two issues were Second Avenue Subway and roads and bridges funding. Now that that's all been sorted out, are you confident?
Yes, and one of the reasons why is because it was, if you remember what happened, we had the board approve a plan last fall. We immediately started the dialogue with the legislature saying, you know, this is how we've revised the plan in response to feedback we got from you as well as other stakeholders. And then the process merged with the budget process for this year, the legislative budget process. And so there was an even tighter discussion in terms of alignment between those two. So I'm at a much higher confidence level that with that alignment and with that discussion, there are no outstanding issues. The issues have been resolved. The items of concern have been addressed, and that I expect the Capital Program Review Board to approve it.
Regarding Second Avenue Subway funding, when you pared out $1 billion from Phase 2 last year, part of the reason we were told from the MTA was that it wasn't just a money issue, it was a capacity issue, that you couldn't necessarily even accomplish all the work, due to manpower. So what has changed, and what do you think you can accomplish in this current capital program for Phase 2? Will you have shovels in the ground by the end of 2019?
Well, what we've committed to do was do the supplemental environmental, restart preliminary engineering, do the design for utility relocation, and maybe get shovels in the ground on that, so you get the utility relocation, done. Do outreach with the community, because we find that to be important. While there was this concern about not asking for money that you couldn't absolutely spend, and that transcended across the majority of the program, there were a number of projects where people looked at it a little differently, and Second Avenue was at the top of that list. And what I mean by that is there was a concern on the part of some that, if you take a look at the long saga of Second Avenue, which goes back to 1930, there were far more times where people said, can't go forward, let's pull back. Far more times than decisions like, let's spend the money to go forward. So we got into a fairly long discussion with the legislature about the importance of making sure appropriate funds were in place to make sure that if we were working really fast, we had the money to be able to start construction, to be able to do that. Second of all, send a very strong signal to other stakeholders that we're committed to doing this. Because whenever you go hat in hand and ask the federal government for dollars, when I started in my career, it was an 80-20 split. Now it's generally overmatched. What does that mean? For every dollar you used to spend back in the 80s or 70s, 80% came from the federal government, 20% came from local sources. Now it's overmatched. Local sources over 50%. We've got to be able to show people that we're serious about this project and that we're committed to doing this project, and it's that important to us. From a capacity standpoint, there is no single project that would do and address the needs New York City Transit has better than Second Avenue Subway. If you ride the Lexington Avenue line every day, you experience that.
Hi, Tom. Can you describe some of the wear that's on the M line and then the need for those businesses and homes or residents of those homes to be relocated when the work begins on that Myrtle Avenue line next year?
Wear meaning the worn out nature of the asset?
That's correct.
Okay. The Myrtle Avenue line is a line that at one point in time used to come all the way down an elevated structure into Brooklyn and then cross over the Brooklyn Bridge, long, long, long time ago. When they stopped going over the Brooklyn Bridge and they truncated back to where it intersects with the J, the BMT made a decision, I think it was 1913, to cut over to that elevated structure. A 400-foot structure that they took the backs of property within 10 feet of houses to be able to construct this. And that structure has served well for over 100 years, but it is fast approaching the end of its useful life. So it needs to be replaced. And there's no easy way to replace it other than taking the line out of service, demolishing the structure, and quickly putting up a replacement. The interrelationship between the Canarsie L line and the M line, if you live in Brooklyn, you know it, because if one line's out, you use the other. So we need to get that work done. At the far northern end of the Myrtle Avenue line, we've got a bridge structure that crosses over the New York and Atlantic Railroad tracks. So we need to replace it too, because it's been hit 4 or 5 times in the last 10 years by freight trains. So we're going to do those repairs, get that work out of the way, so that there is no doubt that the resiliency and the reliability of the M line is there while we do the critical repair work on the Canarsie Avenue too. So it's something that we need to deal with now.
How will the relocation of residents in that time be funded?
Well, it'll come out of the project. I mean, it's very important that we accommodate as best as possible the needs of the people who will be affected by the work. We've got to safely do the work and either temporarily relocate the people or offer them the alternative to be permanently relocated. They're living in buildings that are within that close proximity to the Myrtle Avenue structure.
Yeah, talking about the M train and then shifting over to the L, now that the 2019 date has been set or floated, is the MTA still committed to a full shutdown of the tubes in 2019, or is there a possibility still that the work might be staggered and the L train might still run, albeit, you know, slower or with larger
There's a
gaps?
dialogue going on with the stakeholders, so that would be elected officials, that would be business owners, that would be constituents and customers, to make sure, first of all, they understand what we have to do and why we have to do it. We have to convince them of that. There's a sense of urgency to it on 2 fronts, one of which is the importance of getting the work done because the tube was damaged very badly, to awarding a contract this year so we have access to hundreds of millions of dollars of Sandy funding, which would be at risk if we didn't award the contract, and to do so in a way where we have an engaged process with the community so that we make an informed decision. That sounds a lot of trite, but it's not. An engaged process means interaction with people who will be affected, critical decision makers, informed in the sense that we're letting people know there are pros and cons to either one of those 2 alternatives, and we want to make sure we adequately weigh what those pros and cons are, and don't take the decision in a vacuum. And don't take the decision without other city agencies and what other affected parties, elected officials, and community boards. And so that's part of the process. So we haven't made up our mind yet which is the way to go, because we need to have that level of engagement. And we have some time. We have some months to be able to do so. But by the time we award the contract later this year, we need to have a good understanding whether it's which one of those 2 general options it's going to be. Thank you.